Welcome, everyone. We are so glad to have you joining us for today. Get everybody all set up here. My name is Angie Taylor, and I am the Zoom producer for today's event. We're so glad you could join us for this very important and timely conversation. We will be getting started right about the noon hour. We have about 5 minutes remaining. As you come in, we just want to advise and let you know that we have set up this session so that your microphone nor your camera will be turned on today. You will just be interacting through the chat window. And so I encourage you, if you haven't already done so, locate the chat window. You'll want to navigate to your Zoom toolbar and look for the chat button and go ahead and open that up so that you can start to see communications from other members in our group. We're so glad to have you here today. So today, this is the League of Women Voters of Nebraska's Media Literacy in an Age of Disinformation session. So we are so glad to have you here today. We are going to be featuring our panelist bios as we go through, so you're welcome. If you didn't have a chance to review these previously, this will give you kind of some foundational information as we lead into today. I believe we have folks joining us from all across our great state and perhaps beyond. If you feel so motivated, I think our panelists would be interested in learning where you are joining us from. So if you would like, go ahead and interact in chat. Again, my name is Angie Taylor. I'm just serving as Zoom producer today. So if you have tech questions, go ahead and submit them to me. And then at the end, I will be posing questions that I gather throughout our session to our panelists as time permits at the conclusion. So go ahead. Thank you. Welcome, Claudia from Ogallala. Oh my goodness, totally different time zone. That's exciting. Hope it's good, clear weather out there. Welcome. Keaton at Concordia and Seward, thank you very much. Marion High School, class of 18 juniors are listening. Welcome, high schoolers. You're the same age as my own daughter who today had to take the pre-ACT. So you guys are having a much more fun day at school than she was. Welcome, we're so glad you're here. All right, Chin, I hope I pronounced that correct. Welcome from Lincoln, here in Lincoln. Judith and Hastings, Emily from Seward. Boy, we don't have hardly any repeat ones today. So welcome. Rural Northwest of Hastings, wonderful. This is a great group of people that have assembled for today, and we're so glad to have you join us. If you are just hopping in for today, we want to welcome you to the League of Women Voters of Nebraska webinar virtual event here, where we are going to be discussing disinformation and media literacy. And this is such an important and timely topic. We'll be getting started here in about 2 more minutes, right at the top of the hour. We are so glad that you are putting information in chat here. So my goodness, it's so great to see Sherry from Lincoln and Susan from Lincoln. Thank you both for being here. And Emily Salsley, my former colleague, how great to see you join us today. Thank you for being here, everyone. It's a smaller world than you think. What a wonderful blessing to have such diversity and depth and breadth to our group today. So as we get started, go ahead and you can keep your eye on the slides and the bios of folks and learn more about today's panelists. We thank each of them sincerely for joining us. Very shortly, I'm going to be turning the reins over to today's moderator, and we're going to give folks just another minute or so to get hopped in before we proceed. So we encourage you to interact in chat. Thank you for introducing yourselves and where you're from. At any time as we go through today, you are cordially not only invited, but encouraged to submit questions, which I will do my very best to aggregate and then, if time allows at the end, propose to our panelists. So here we have Jonathan joining us from Madison, Wisconsin. That's wonderful. I love Madison. I have family up there. I love Lake Mendota and Minota. Oh my gosh, it's so much fun up there. And Mary Lee, thank you for joining us. A former Nebraskan, now in Indiana. Wonderful. I had a great aunt who lived in Raceway, Indiana, near the Indianapolis 500, and the plates on her walls had to come down on race days because it shook their house so much. So Indiana, it's great to have you represent. We're just so glad you're here. All right, here we are right at the top of the hour. I'm going to go ahead and get us started. We are so glad that you are here today for the League of Women Voters of Nebraska Media Literacy in an Age of Disinformation event. This is a 1-hour event. And again, my name is Angie Taylor. If you have questions, you are more than welcome to reach out to me by chat or if needed by private chat, just directly to me here in the window. And with this, I'm going to introduce today's moderator, Diane Bystrom. Thank you so much for being here, everyone.
Thank you, Angie. I am Diane Bystrom. I am the Director of Communication for the League of Women Voters of Nebraska, recently retired from Iowa State University where I directed the Center for Women in Politics for about 22 years. Started out as a journalist and then ended up being interviewed by journalists. And so really interested in this topic, as are the League of Women Voters. We're pleased to have with us today 3 faculty members who actually teach and study media literacy in the state of Nebraska, as well as a research analyst from the Pew Research Center, which is headquartered in Washington, D.C. I'm going to briefly introduce our 4 panelists and then turn it over. Tobin Beck is an assistant professor of journalism and political science at Concordia University, where he teaches courses on journalism and global issues. He has more than 30 years of experience in journalism, including with several United Press international bureaus, including Washington, D.C. Peggy Ruprick is an associate professor of journalism and public relations at Creighton University, where she teaches courses in media and digital literacy, American journalism history, and public relations. She also has experience as a broadcast journalist in Omaha and Green Bay, Wisconsin. Ryan Teton is Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Nebraska-Kearney. He studies the impact of social media on information consumption and has published numerous articles and books focusing on political communication and other topics. And finally, Mason Walker is a research analyst focusing on journalism and media at the Pew Research Center, again in Washington, D.C. He will open today's program with a slide presentation with an overview of Pew's research findings on news media attitudes in a polarized America. And following his brief presentation, we will move to our panel discussion. Mason?
Thank you, Diane. I think the slides are loading. So as we wait for those, I would just like to say I'm a research analyst at the Pew Research Center here in Washington, D.C. For those who haven't heard of the Pew Research Center before, we are a nonprofit organization whose mission is to generate a, oh, thank you, I see they've loaded, a foundation of facts for public dialogue. We conduct kind of public opinion polling, demographic research, as well as other types of social science research. Okay, there we go. So I would like to just first start this presentation by exploring some of the research Pew has done to understand Americans' views of the news media, and then talk a little about partisan divides and Americans' views of fact checkers, and then wrap things up by talking about where Americans get their news more broadly. So starting here in this first chart, I kind of like to introduce the audience to like a surface level of kind of the level of confidence and trust that Americans place in different aspects of the news media. As you can see here, a majority of Americans have a lot or some trust in the information that comes from national news organizations. You can see in 2021, 58% of Americans said this, though, however, you can see this has declined over the years since when we first asked this question in 2016. Local news organizations tend to have higher rates than national news organizations when it comes to the level of trust Americans place in them. And then as you can see on the right here, social media is a place where, though many Americans get information, they place relatively low levels of confidence and trust in the information they get there. And as you can see across all these 3 different types of media, there are fairly strong partisan divides, and these have grown over the years. Americans have a number of specific kind of reservations about the news media's role, standards, and impact on society. As you can see here, across these kind of 5 areas we asked about in this particular question, Americans rate only one of these areas more positively than negatively, and that's whether news organizations care about how good of a job they do. Just under half of Americans, 45%, say they do care, slightly higher than the share that say they do not care, 37%. The remaining 17% had kind of were neither in their views of this particular question. The remaining 4 evaluations here, Americans were more likely to hold a negative than positive view of the media's role in society. And then when it comes to confidence in the news media, just under half of Americans, 45%, say the public has either a fair amount or great deal of confidence in the institution. Just 6% say the public has a great deal of confidence. And when it comes to what is the correct amount of confidence they place in the news media, Americans are fairly split in their answers, as you can see. Compared to other individuals and institutions, journalists tend to rank toward the bottom when it comes to the level of confidence Americans place in them. You can see journalists are just only above elected officials here in the level of confidence. And then here across a range of issues, Americans see issues with news outlets' transparency, particularly as it relates to disclosing their finances and potential conflicts of interests, as well as how they communicate to readers the sources they use and cite in news articles. So almost 6 in 10 Americans say it's better for society if the American public is skeptical of the news media. This compares to around 36% who say it's better to be trusting. And while a majority of Americans say it's healthy for society to be skeptical of the news media, a vast majority of Americans say it is possible for the public to improve its level of confidence. A rather large topic of late in the national discussion has been the issue of fake or made-up news. When we asked this question back in 2019, before the presidential election, we saw that around half, or I guess exactly half of Americans said made-up news was a very big problem faced by the country today. And when it comes to kind of the issue of made-up news, Americans tend to blame others more so than journalists for the creation of made-up news. They tend to place higher fault with political leaders, their staff, as well as activist groups. But even though Americans do not see journalists kind of as a leading contributor of made-up news and information, they do believe it is primarily their responsibility to fix the problem. So I'm going to dive a little bit into partisan divides here. As you can see here, we ask kind of this broad range of questions asking about trust and confidence in the news media, each kind of getting at a different aspect of trust. And you can see here kind of across these broad range of questions, Republicans tend to be far more critical of the news media than Democrats. And here we kind of say a similar thing when we ask about certain evaluations of the media. Republicans just overall tend to be far more critical of the media than Democrats. Attitudes towards media is kind of fact-checking and watchdog role. And while Americans are evenly split, and while both Republicans and Democrats tend to differ in their level of confidence and trust in the news media, both parties tend to overwhelmingly value the watchdog role of journalists and the role that media serves over watching over elected officials. As you can see here, majorities of both parties, as well as Americans overall, tend to say this. And when it comes to the issue of fact-checking, Americans are about evenly split on whether fact-checking efforts by news organizations tend to favor one side. Again, you can see there are strong partisan divides to this question. 28% of Republicans say fact-checkers deal fairly with all sides, while 69% of Democrats say the same. And most Americans tend to be fairly confident in their own abilities to check the accuracy of a news story themselves. However, not shown here, we have asked in the past, how do Americans tend to rate others in their ability to find information or decipher made-up news? And the consensus is that while people place a lot of confidence in themselves, they don't place a lot of confidence in others to kind of navigate the media environment and find accurate information. Where Americans get news. So when it comes to where Americans are getting their news, a vast majority, 86% of Americans say they either often or sometimes get news from a digital device. 68% of Americans get news either often or sometimes from television. And as you can imagine, there are quite large generational divides when it comes to what platforms Americans turn to for news, as well as the individual outlets they go to. In regards to social media in particular, we've seen that around half of Americans say they often or sometimes get news there. In 2021, this is down slightly from 2020 when 53% of Americans said this. And then here we see kind of the individual social media sites that Americans turn to for news. When looking at individual social media sites, Facebook is by and large the social media site that most Americans both use and regularly get news from. As you can see here, 31% of US adults get news on the site regularly. By comparison, just 22% of Americans get news on YouTube, which is kind of the second largest social media site for news use. And then as you can see, it drops off quite precipitously after that. And I'll just comment here too as well that we also see generational divides in the members of society who are getting news from these individual sites. Younger folks, more diverse folks tend to get news from some of these smaller social media sites, whereas Facebook tends to more represent the general public at large. And I want to be mindful of time, so I think I will take questions later, but I'm happy to answer any and all questions. I know we're going to have a discussion too of some of these findings.
Well, thank you, Mason. That was just a great overview. And I would encourage any of you to log into the Pew Research Center. You can find them, through a Google search. They do wonderful in-depth research, and Mason's given us a great overview tonight, probably or today, this afternoon, probably 20 studies that they've done. And so he has a lot of good information there. We are going to turn it over now to the panel discussion, which Mason will also be on for. But our first question, we're going to throw out to the three faculty panelists here, starting with Tobin Beck. But the question is for the three faculty here, how can we effectively teach, model, and encourage people to use critical thinking skills when reading, watching, or listening to the news media? So Tobin, we're going to start with you.
Okay, thank you.
Peggy, and then Ryan.
Okay, and I would ask those of you who are watching and listening to think about yourself and how you form your opinions about political issues and how you think about the news. A lot of times we tend to focus on things that we like and get information from people that we trust. And I would ask that you think about how we look at all sides of information and the importance of looking at all sides. John Stuart Mill, who was a political philosopher, suggested it's a good idea to consider that you might be wrong and to think about what things look like from the other side of an issue. And then as you look at and try to identify what the facts are and separate fact from opinion, consider all sides, and then bring back what your beliefs and principles are. You don't get rid of your beliefs and principles, but you try to identify first what the facts are, and then see how are those facts presented. Are the facts actually facts? And if opinions are presented, are the opinions linked to facts and linked to facts that you can check? In doing fact checking, it's a good idea to look at multiple sources to compare how those sources are using facts. Do the facts line up, or are they told from different perspectives? Those different perspectives can greatly change how those facts are perceived and what they mean, and the opinions that are based on those facts. So I would start there with those being critical thinking skills. Critical thinking, the way I've defined it and use it in the classes that I teach, is first of all, discerning what information is credible, what information is not, so that we can make decisions based on that information, or that we can reject the information as not being credible and not being useful. Mason, when you were talking about responsibility for fake news, made up news, yes, definitely hold the media accountable. I think there is a great responsibility for media to do that, but I also think it's incumbent on us as consumers to also be able to do that. And it's important that once we realize that we can do that, we have the skills, the power to do that, then it becomes a very empowering sort of thing to think of our role as citizens in holding the media accountable, but also holding leaders accountable.
We'll go to Peggy next. And like at some universities, and it's been encouraged to teach classes on media literacy. And I know Peggy teaches one for students. So Peggy, what are your thoughts on this question?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me today. A lot of good information's already come out. The notion of confirmation bias, Tobin talked a little bit about that we may go into a story thinking that we already know or that we already believe something, and that we need to guard against that when we're looking at news, when we're consuming news. We need to critically look at the news sources that we're reading or watching. What are the facts that are presented? What is the source of the information? And critically look at that and ask some questions. Are there multiple points of view that are being presented? And what are those points of view? What sources are we being offered? Partisan news in and of itself isn't necessarily bad. But we need to look and see, are they offering other viewpoints? Are those insights thoughtful? The other thing that I tell my students is that it's important to consume a variety of news sources. So if you are conservative, to look at a liberal media or vice versa, because then you get a full and complete picture, and you can more critically assess. I also think that these are important issues, not just to start talking about at the college level, but I hope that, as soon as young people are on their digital devices, that these conversations are happening in even upper level elementary classrooms and middle school and high school, because these digital natives, I don't think, have thought even very deeply about the types of news content that they're seeing. And there is a lot of belief that the news out there is all fake. So I think it's important to start educating people early on this process.
I couldn't agree more. And I want to say that there are some high school students on today, including a class of 18 from Marion High School. So again,
terrific.
High school. Ryan, what are your thoughts on this question?
I just want to echo first what Tobin and Peggy discussed, and that is that comparing news sources is probably one of the most important parts. Now, that's also the most difficult part because we don't have time. And the news makes it really, really easy, especially visually, to take an entire story and boil it down to a single headline or a picture. And I would warn the people who are participating here that, that is framing. That is a frame that is specifically chosen to present that story in a very specific way. And unfortunately, especially when we're gleaning information from social media, like Mason pointed out, we run the danger of what's known as Slacktivism, which is reading the headline, getting worked up about it, and then forwarding it all to your friends without actually checking in to see, okay, what is the story? What's going on behind it? And the imagery makes a difference there as well. There was a study that was done that showed encouragement to get out to different rallies across the country. And when the picture was used about having a little police brutality or showing that there could be conflict, the turnout was about 60% lower than when it was a picture based on the subject itself. So what we have to do is understand that what we're looking at is always somebody else's envisioning of what that subject looks like. And it's really important to try and boil that down to how I interpret it given everything else that's out there, and really dig a little bit deeper than a click or a like or a share, I think.
True. This is a related question. We're going to turn to Mason now to share us a little bit more about the research at the Pew Center. So kind of the flip side of teaching kind of critical thinking is, what do we know, Mason, about Americans' confidence in being able to spot misinformation and fake news? So what do we know about their confidence in doing that?
Yeah, so we've typically, when we've done our kind of surveys asking about kind of made up news and information, we typically have two questions that we ask. Kind of the first one is, how do you rate your own ability to spot made up news? And then the second one is, how do you rate the public's ability to kind of spot, identify made up news and information? And there's kind of an interesting paradox that emerges. People tend to rate their own abilities quite high, and yet they rate the public's quite low. So there's an interesting paradox there. I think there's more to unpack, both on the research and there. What does that mean? But I know too that in the past we've done a study, I think it's about 3 or 4 years old now, where we asked people to navigate certain factual and kind of opinion information and rate that. Is this a fact? Is this opinion? And what we kind of saw is, depending on the statement itself, people just really, really struggle with knowing the difference at times. What is a fact? What is an opinion?
I actually used that Pew survey in my media literacy class to start our discussion about media literacy. It's terrific.
We all love Pew, and I love these new survey research. I do a lot of research on women in politics, and it's the same thing, Mason. Like, would you vote for a woman president? Oh yeah. You think your neighbor would? Probably not. So that's an interesting line. Okay, we're going to turn to both Peggy and Ryan on this next question, a little bit related, but digging in deeper. As consumers of news, what resources can we turn to differentiate between false versus factual information? And we'll go to Peggy first.
There's a couple of sources that I discuss in my class. The first is factcheck.org. It's run out of the Annenberg Public Policy Center out of the University of Pennsylvania. I think it's a terrific source. You'll see fact check being used during election years. News organizations will use it when there is a political debate or a politician is giving a speech to check what they've had to say. But it's also used outside of the election cycle. This organization does a good job answering questions, maybe clearing up myths about things that are out in the world, maybe some misinformation. I also like allsides.com. Allsides.com is an organization that was started to basically share with everyone that, yes, we all have partisan or bias as we're looking at the media, and and that's understandable. But to give you some insights on why you might view news a certain way. So they have a bell chart that they present media as far right, far left, in the center. And they also allow people to go to the site and read stories from different news organizations that maybe have differences in opinion. So today, for instance, there's a story on the Federal Reserve and pandemic era stimulus. So you can read a news article from a conservative publication, from a central, a moderate publication, and maybe one that is more liberal, and draw your own conclusions. I tell my students in research, in qualitative research, we talk about triangulation of data, bringing in all of these data points together to draw conclusions where the truth lies within the data. And you can really do that as well when you're looking at different media sources. What are they all saying about a certain topic? And where there's commonality, that's probably where the truth is.
Okay, Ryan, your thoughts on this? I want to add that Angie's dropping websites on fact check, and then she will too on all sides, which, by the way, you can also take a test on all sides to figure out your political persuasion. So Ryan, what are your thoughts on this question?
Well, the first part is, as a source for elections, I would recommend VoteSmart. There are several sites that are out there that will take a look at the issues just from the legislative perspective. What bill was passed, how active was someone on this piece of legislation. But in terms of finding that source, I think it's important for people to get outside their own echo chambers. We have fallbacks that we go to for our news sources, whether it's CNN or Fox, and CNN was actually mentioned in one of these comments as well. But I could take the same story from Fox and the same story from CNN that are airing at exactly the same times, and they will be completely different. The context will be different, the imagery will be different, the suggestions of what happened will be different. And so I think it's important for people to get outside of relying on these for their information. It's kind of the truth is out there kind of situation. But more than anything, and I think it's here, I would say, Sherry, that open-mindedness is super important, because you said, I have something that I believe, and my daughter, or was it granddaughter, said, well, I think it's actually this. And you went, oh my gosh, well, it is. I see that. And there are so many people who, when faced with even information or anything that would be logically the evidence towards A, B, or C, will say, well, I don't believe that. And instead, the truth is buried in there somewhere. And that's really hard to get to. So I would just say it's important to not surround ourselves in echo chambers, and per Mason's comment too, that's all we do really in social media sites. That's what we're finding. That's one of the reasons that the Trump campaign has looked at starting their own social media site, is because, if it's not sounding the way you do, you hide that friend. If they upset you with a comment, you unfriend them. And so we end up getting surrounded by people who sound the same and echo the same kind of things. And boy, if that's misinformation, that's all you get day and night. And so that, in effect, that perception becomes your reality.
Thank you. Now we're going to turn and we're going to talk a little bit more about Pew Research data. And one of the things that Pew shows is that Americans view skepticism of the media as healthy. That's a healthy thing. So based on that, and we're going to first turn to Mason and then Tobin, what should news organizations be concerned about the public's low trust in them? So talk a little bit about what the media should be concerned about, given the fact that people think skepticism is healthy. Mason,
Yeah, well, yeah, I can't really speak to like what news media organizations should be concerned about, but I'll just say on the surface level, that number does sound scary. That 63% who say it's healthy to be skeptical of the news media, but I think there's some nuance there, right? 3/4 of Americans, 75%, do say it is possible to improve their confidence, others' confidence in the media. And I listed a lot of these societal roles that Americans tended to be kind of down on the media, but there are certain roles that Americans do see value in. I mentioned the watchdog role. Overwhelmingly, the broad public, even partisans said, they value that role the media provides to society, that watchdog role over officials. So I'll just say yes, that number does sound scary, but there's a lot of nuance there to unpack. And I think, if the media were able to communicate those types of roles that provides, maybe that's a way of improving confidence. But I also mentioned there were certain things that I think Americans would potentially maybe like to see more in their media. I mentioned that they thought maybe media organizations don't do that well kind of communicating, how are media organizations funded? What are the potential conflicts of interest? How do they choose and find sources? We did a focus group a few years back where one of the things that really kind of confused a lot of people was kind of, anonymous sources. What does that mean? So maybe it is just better communicating to the public certain aspects of reporting, those types of things that could maybe distill a better sense of trust.
And Tobin, you have a lot of experience, not only in academia, but also as a former bureau chief for UPI. What do you think news organizations should be concerned about the public's low trust in it? What do you think their concerns should be?
Well, I think several things, and I take Mason's point about nuance here. I completely agree that it's healthy to be skeptical. It's essential to be skeptical. Absolutely, I'm skeptical of what I read, and if I'm not, I remind myself that I should be. But there's a big difference between being skeptical and being cynical. You don't want to be cynical with expecting that news is just bad, that reporters are only in it for helping some particular point of view. So what I think media should be concerned, but also they should be pointing out to the public how they're doing their job and that they are doing their job. That, again, getting back to making sure that the facts are there, making sure that on news reports, opinion is kept out. Reporters don't include their opinion in writing news, that analysis, commentary, op-eds are clearly labeled and so forth. And again, that the facts are checkable and consistent and accurate. I think also that would help if media would maybe let the public know more about the ethics that every major news organization abides by. We all have codes of ethics in the profession that we're very serious about following. And I'm not sure that the public realizes that or knows how those ethical standards come into play. But there's something else also that's kind of embedded in this that I think Mason kind of touched on earlier. And that's the big partisan divide in trust also suggests possibly something else that's going on, which is on this question of open-mindedness, closed-mindedness. If there are strong opinions that media is not trustworthy, okay, then what is trustworthy as a source of information? And if you're saying that only the leaders of my political party or only certain politicians are trustworthy with what they say, that creates another problem of, okay, how do we know whether that information is accurate, or are you blindly accepting that as truth without being concerned about the accuracy? So getting back to the question of critical thinking, of being able to compare facts, try to vet whether the facts are accurate or not, and being able definitely to separate fact from opinion. But by and large, I think it's healthy for people to be skeptical and to hold media accountable.
We're going to dig a little bit deeper into this, and this is your opportunity to basically give advice to the media on steps they could take to improve Americans' perception of it. We talked a little bit about the skepticism and if the media should be concerned, but now this is your opportunity to give advice to the media on steps that they could take to improve Americans' perception of it. We're going to start with Ryan Teton for his advice to the media.
My advice. Okay, I'll try my best on this one. I'll give it in the context of the tale of two interviews. The first interview that I conducted was with Dan Rather. And Dan Rather is one of the former nightly anchors on the NBC or CBS or ABC Nightly News. And he said, back in the day when Edward R. Murrow was reporting, when we had these classic journalists, they sought the truth. And the truth was what kind of drove the news. Whereas now, he said, it's almost completely ad driven. And when you are linked to advertisement and revenue in such a strong way, it tends to influence the information that you're putting out. And that's one of the reasons he stepped back. So I think it's those links that Mason had talked about, and Tobin as well. When you have news organizations that are linked to, for example, Sinclair Media, well, these news organizations will issue a response at the beginning of the day saying, this is our line on this subject. Make sure every story that you report is taking this line on this subject. There's not a whole lot of wiggle room there. But I think in order to get a new audience, the other interview was with Jon Stewart. And Jon Stewart said, well, you can't hold me accountable for sharing news information because it's a joke show. And after I did a study with it, I said, well, you can't take that position. You're providing more news in your half hour than the national news is doing anymore, because they average, 2 or 3 seconds of a soundbite. And so I think news itself needs to evolve. We saw it go towards the Daily Show, et cetera. We see that people are getting away from the nightly news and moving to social media. I think there's a gap that could be filled there by some entity to be able to provide that in a way that isn't ad driven, and that, you know, maybe has a little satire and honesty to it that we respond to as viewers and consumers.
Thanks, Ryan. Now we'll turn to Peggy. What would your advice be to the media to improve our perceptions?
Well, I think especially local media has an opportunity to really engage with stakeholders, with consumers in their own communities. And I'm putting my PR hat on for a little bit. You know, we talk about stakeholder engagement and some of the facets of that, including trust and transparency. So, you know, I think that if local media reporters, editors are involved in their communities, that people know them as the people that are part of the Kiwanis Club, that they're doing the volunteer work, that they're out in the community. I think that that helps to build trust. They know that these are people that are living and working within their own communities, and so that, and they can have that level of trust. I think also that as consumers of news, we need to realize that news organizations aren't monolithic, right? There are good news organizations. There are sources of news that maybe are a little bit questionable. And again, I think that it falls upon us as consumers to be discerning about that, right? We don't assume that all lawyers are the same, or we don't assume that all teachers are the same. We live in a really dynamic and complex world, and to say unilaterally that, oh, we can't trust the news media, everything is fake, I think it is really a bit simplistic, that we need to take a broader view and recognize that there are some good organizations, news organizations out there. And as consumers, we need to support those organizations, support them with a subscription or to watch them.
All right, thanks, Peggy. And finally, Tobin, do you have any other advice for the news media on how they can improve the public's perception?
I think so. I think the points that have been mentioned are very good ones. Ryan's point about soft news, Peggy, yours about local media, which I think local news is some of the toughest news to do well, because you get immediate feedback from everybody about whatever you reported. But yeah, it's hugely important. One thing that's troubled me for a long time about news media that I keep trying to figure out ways for me and my colleagues to do this better is uncovering issues. And that is particularly major social and political issues that take time, that take some effort to dig into, and that for economic reasons and a whole bunch of other reasons that we could talk for a couple hours explaining, we've seen a drop off in that type of news. But one thing that's stuck in my mind for a long time, back in 2014, AP and GFK did a survey of public opinion about people's perception of issues. And I believe Pew has done work on this as well. And what stuck with me is that people said, we don't understand issues. Issues are too complex for us to understand. And if a majority of people feel that way in the country, you know, how the heck do we have a democracy, and how do we figure out things like what Congress is doing? What are our expectations for policy if we don't think we can understand the issues? It's incumbent on media to be able to explain those in a way that's accessible and understandable. And then so that as citizens, we can access and learn about these things, because also as was mentioned earlier, Ryan, I believe that you mentioned about the amount of time it takes to really understand things. And if we have to spend hours digging through things to try to find and piece together background and context so that we can understand what's going on now in Congress with the social safety net bill, or with the infrastructure bill and so on, or what the Supreme Court is doing with considering issues of gun control, abortion, whatever it is, we're going to default to opinions that are based on gut level reaction rather than facts.
Thanks. Okay, I just have one more question for you, and just brief, and then we're going to turn it over to the audience questions. So again, let's try to wrap this up in about 5 minutes, but I'm going to ask all of you to respond to it. So really, it's just your opportunity to offer your final thoughts on what else you'd like to add to the discussion on media literacy and the age of disinformation. So final thoughts, and we'll start with Mason.
Yeah, so I think we've at Pew, we've done a lot of studies kind of looking at trust, and we've seen that the number one kind of factor that drives variations in trust is partisanship. No surprise. But there are things that we see that do, certain groups do have more trust than others. Connectedness is one thing, and there's few demographic groups that tend to have higher trust than others, but I think what's important to remember is, I think Peggy said this, that the media isn't monolithic. There's a lot of nuances. We've seen there are certain parts of the media ecosystem that do have actually fairly high levels of trust. Local news is one of them. So I think it's important to remember in that context. Also, another context to remember is this decline in trust that we've seen over the years in the media isn't a phenomenon strictly to the media itself. We've seen this across various institutions. At Pew, we've measured this at various levels of government. We've seen it, people have declining trust in corporations. So this isn't just a media phenomenon. And lastly, I've done a lot of work in this space, but it's important to remember that this declining level of trust, confidence also comes at a time where there are less resources devoted to news. We've seen declining newsroom employment. We've seen drastic drops in revenues for certain sectors of the media, in particular newspapers, which have just really shriveled over the years. So I think it's important to kind of remember all this contextual information when we think about trust and the ways to build it, the mechanisms, how do we go about it, etc.
Okay, next we'll turn to Peggy, and then Tobin, and then Ryan. Peggy.
So I want to echo what Mason was talking about. One of the things that I tell my students when they leave class, I said, if you do one thing when you leave this media literacy class is to purchase a subscription to a newspaper, whether it's digital, whether it's a printed paper. Of course, young people are not doing printed papers anymore, but I think that I have a real concern about the decline in newsrooms because they don't have the funding to pay their reporters to cover those stories. With the advent of digital technology, so many people think that they can get their news for free, that they don't have to pay for news. And it's really critical that we continue to support those good quality news organizations. I think that will help to mitigate those conspiracy theory sites, the fake news sites, and to continue to provide consumers with accurate information that they can trust about a variety of issues.
Okay, Tobin.
I would just kind of reiterate what's already been said. Judith just posted a good question in chat about the result of media consolidation, and the result of that is fewer voices, basically fewer separate independent reports being done, and more basically similarity in the reporting that gets done. But again, to reiterate the importance of critical thinking, that it's on consumers, it's on us as well to be able to discern what's credible from what isn't, and hold media accountable while also holding our leaders accountable and society accountable. It's a two-way street. There's a lot of responsibility on the media, a lot of responsibility on us as well.
And finally, Ryan, your thoughts?
I would say that we actually have to become less ADD as a country when it comes to news. We used to deal with nightly news programs that were an hour long, and then as we're seeing the attention span get shorter and shorter. I mean, SpongeBob episodes were then 7 minutes long, and now TikTok videos are 9 seconds long. And a lot of that is frustrating if we're trying to look for information. If the people who are participating here say, well, I'd like to find information, and it's tough. I mean, you really got to dig through some things, but I would say that the fact that you are looking shows that you are becoming a better consumer of that information. And there are primers out there. I wouldn't use Wikipedia, but for example, if you believe you have an illness, WebMD and the Mayo Clinic, you can go to a page that kind of links everything for you. So if you're sitting at home and saying, okay, what is going on in India, or why is China embracing this economic policy, or what is the position of this on healthcare, you can probably find an institution, and I would use Mason as a perfect example, like Pew, that has statistics and that has information and that has what the view of the people is and what's actually going on. So although it's tough, I think we need to invest more time into figuring out what's going on with these big issues, because they affect every aspect of our life. So we need to be more well-versed, I think.
All right. Thank you, panelists. And we now are going to turn it over to Angie. She's going to be asking you guys questions that have been posed in the chat. So Angie, please take over.
Sure. So there were some great opinions as well as questions posed in chat. The first one, the earliest one, I think was directed more toward Mason. This one's for you. It was Doris, I'm going to pronounce it Gamble. I hope I didn't pronounce that wrong. She asked, what is the difference between confidence and proficiency, and whether that tips the balance, I suspect, one way or the other in the research and the verbiage that you use.
Yeah, so there is some variation there. So I think proficiency would be able, has more of a navigation type aspect to it, whereas in confidence, I think is more of a trust. So I think that's kind of how we use those terms. I don't think we use confidence mainly as a synonym of trust, and there sometimes we use them interchangeably, but I don't think we really use proficiency a whole lot for that very reason. I think more we've done some tests. I think some people kind of associate proficiency with more of a way of navigation.
Words matter.
Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you so kindly. All right. The next question was posed by Doris Heaston, and it came through at the time when Mason was speaking, but if others wish to join in, you're more than welcome. Her question was, pre-social media, have there been other periods in American history when confidence in print media was so low? And also, what about independent voters? So I think the independent voters is specifically for Mason, and then I will start with you and then open it up thereafter.
I teach a journalism history class. I'll take part of that question. Sometimes people will say to me, oh, the news media is so biased, the news media is so partisan. And I tell them that partisan media is a part of our nation's history, dating back to pre-Revolutionary War, right? We had the pro-colonial newspapers and the pro-British. And then later on, we had pro-abolitionist newspapers, pro-slavery. So we've had these periods of time where people have questioned the content that is coming out, and there have been these moments of partisanship and debate. So I don't know that this is anything new. I think that the difference this time is that the ability, because of digital communication, because of social media, to share and spread this information has just been magnified. I don't know if that completely answers the question, but maybe answers part of it, that we've had these periods of history where this has happened before.
Thank you, Peggy. Were there others that wish to speak about in response to this question? Tobin?
I was just going to real briefly say that, as you point out, newspapers up until around the turn of the 20th century, as you well know, were very opinionated and included opinion with the facts. One of the things that changed the paradigm of American journalism was the rise of wire services in the early 20th century. AP started 1848, but then United Press 1907, International News Service 1909. Competing with AP, because to get the widest range of customers possible, they had to report just the facts and leave opinion out. And that kind of helped create this paradigm of objective journalism focusing on facts as separate from opinion.
Wonderful.
I can answer the last part about independence if you want. We typically at Pew, we don't really measure independence because true independents are actually a relatively small and rare breed. We found that people who claim to be independent actually tend to lean towards one party or the other. So we tend to group those people in. So we typically in our reports will have lean Republicans / Republicans, Democrats, lean Democrats as our main breaks for when we do break it out by party affiliation. But yes, true independents are a very small and rare breed, so we don't typically measure them.
And if I can kick in just at the end, Angie, as far as the partisanship too, I think it's important that we note that the news does play a very, very important role in public surveillance. I mean, in monitoring governmental operations and trying to say, hey, there's something wrong going on there, and we should know about this. Unfortunately, I think that it tends to, with the spread of media and the spread of new media and the internet, it tends to get wrapped up into other priorities that they have ongoing within the news channel. It's an example of seeing breaking news at the bottom. Well, that originated after 9/11, but now it's breaking news if they have a commercial break coming up. I mean, it's just used interchangeably to grab the attention and focus it right there and keep your attention there while they're talking. And so I think that we have to respect that the media has a very important role, but we have to be able to take that in stride too.
Wonderful. Well said, everyone. Thank you so kindly. The next question is posed by Mary Spurgeon, and her question was, what is the place of public media, such as NewsHour, National Public Radio, who have corporate sponsorships, and then their responsibility to disclose that when they do a story that involves one of them, for example, Facebook? Do you think, I think her question might be, would that change the game for corporate media to make that more transparent? And Mary, if you have other clarifying things you want to add in there, that's kind of a hard question to answer. Well, we'll see if she'll clarify exactly what unless somebody, Tobin, do you want to speak to that?
I was just going to say, from colleagues of mine who work in public media at local and national levels, the firewall between the corporate funding and between the news that they cover is very strong. And the influence in terms of, are we going to do a story a certain way because it might offend a corporate sponsor? I would say, in my opinion, based on what I've seen, it's not really a factor. It could be, I suppose, if they were to do more intensive investigations of Facebook, for example, but I really, from what I've seen, I have not seen that.
I would add that, I think we have to understand that when there is a large group of people taking their information from Facebook or from even a Google search, those are algorithms that are based on the amount of likes, shares, and comments that would come from that. I think one of the most recent stories on Facebook showed that they were more prone to share negative and kind of exploitive stories because it got more of a response and people got more shares and they got more likes. I mean, if you say, hey, we've tweaked the tax code and here's an explanation of it, boy, that is not anywhere near as engaging as, oh my gosh, what's going on in Washington, D.C., and hurry up and share it. So I think we have to understand that these are based on consumerism. They are for-profit agencies when we look at things like Google and Facebook. And in the end, that leads to the dilemma of, do they have the interest of the people in mind, or do they have the interest in driving their advertising and the other people who paid in mind?
And to go off of Ryan's comment too, there's actually research out now on outrage culture and the effects of putting salacious or provocative things online. What's enraging is engaging. Chakravartinka did a great podcast, Hidden Brain, where he talks about the culture of outrage and interviews an academic. So it's a very real phenomenon that we as consumers, once again, need to be aware of, that news organizations are for-profit organizations, except for NPR and the like, and they need to do what they can to try to attract readers and viewers, and sometimes some of those techniques.
But to what extent does the corporate contribution impact the news coverage? Does it impact the news coverage?
No, and I'm not suggesting in that. I'm just saying that for those conspiracy theory sites, for the fake news sites, and even for some mainstream sites, that outrage culture is a real thing, to use emotions. I'm not suggesting for nonprofits or for sites like NPR.
Yeah, I'll just chime in here with a quick data point. So we in a recent study, we kind of asked, a series of questions, how well do you think the news media does X, Y, and Z? And one of the questions we asked is, how well does the media explain where their money comes from, their funding? And we saw overwhelmingly that 72% of Americans thought that news organizations either didn't do a very good job explaining that aspect of their reporting. So I think that's kind of an interesting thing for news organizations maybe to think about. And it's something I personally hope to kind of study a little bit more, is that corporate aspect of the media and some of our future research.
Wonderful. Thank you all. I will add as an aside that I work in the tech sector, and I attended a conference last week where they mentioned a fairly new documentary that came out called Coded Bias that discusses the algorithms that Ryan was talking about. If you haven't seen it, as a general citizen, it will be very eye-opening, I think, for anyone. So I did put the link to the PBS version. You can also find it, I think, for free on Netflix if you're a member there. All right, we have time for one final question as we head into today, which is sad because there are several great questions now popping up in chat. The last one we'll address today: what is the result, in your opinion, of the consolidation of the ownership of media outlets? So anybody want to start with that one?
I had addressed that a little bit earlier, that the result of the consolidation is fewer voices is one major result of it.
Thank you.
I would say that it takes some of the sovereignty out of the reporter's hands, the ability to actually fully document in whatever frame they might choose, or objective frame whatever was going on, because there is that drive again for ad and revenue.
We did fairly well address that previously. We have maybe we could do one more.
That's a trend. That's a trend we're seeing both in broadcast and also in print with consolidation. In print, a shrinking and consolidation, and somewhat in broadcast as well, particularly radio, but to some extent TV.
Thank you. All right, well, we'll do one final quick question. We have 3 minutes only remaining. We want to honor everyone's time. While it is understandable that print media has become expensive, how does that impact the ability of the average citizen to utilize that source?
Do you mean expensive in terms of people subscribing to newspapers?
I suspect and so forth? By individual people.
There still are some great sources that are free. apnews.com is free and is a great source. AP is fairly neutral and comprehensive, so I would recommend that. There are others as well that are free, but yeah, that's a problem if you want to read newspapers, that you get a few stories and then the firewall or the paywall kicks in.
And I would share that for most of the print newspapers, their revenue is almost completely driven by online ads at this point. That for a lot of these, the print of the newspaper is kind of a sidelight and a holdover from the way they used to do things. I could see a time period when that printable, deliverable news just becomes completely irrelevant or not even a functioning business model anymore.
Yeah, that's one of the.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Peggy.
That's one of the things that news organizations are going to need to look at as they transition. How do they remain profitable? How can they keep their doors open, keep their reporters employed, still make a profit? And one of the results of that may be eliminating that print publication.
Yeah, I'll just add to, newspapers are kind of one of the interesting sectors of the media ecosystem in which there's just a lot of experimentation going on. You have some nonprofits popping up. I believe there's a paper in Utah, I forget which one exactly, that's trying to become a nonprofit or has become a nonprofit.
Like City Tribune, yes.
Yes. And then you have kind of some papers like the Washington Post who now have extremely wealthy benefactors such as Jeff Bezos to fund them. I think something similar happened with the Los Angeles Times and the San Diego Tribune to try to I think they sold themselves to a billionaire. I forget his name exactly. But you just have a lot of experimentation within that sector of the media ecosystem, just trying to see whatever works because it's just very in flux and rapidly changing.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all. In conclusion, we are arriving now at the top of the hour. I want to share with you one final comment that just appeared in chat as we send everybody off into the rest of their day and the great beyond. I believe this is probably the Omaha Marion class that replied, "We had good spin-off discussions here in the high school journalism classroom. Thank you for inviting us to join in. Please know that there is a new generation of young journalists who are discussing these issues and who care about the confidence level and the critical thinking skills that come from being a producer and consumer of news." So with that hopeful end to our day, I want to give extraordinary thanks, not only to Diane, our moderator for today, but to Mason, Peggy, Tobin, Ryan,
Thank you.
You guys have been extraordinary. Thank you for this wonderful session. Thank you all for joining us. And we hope that you will consider joining us 1 week from today on Thursday, the 11th, same time, same place. And we hope to see you soon. Everyone, thank you kindly and all best wishes.